You know that one thing almost everyone seems to agree on about Jesus, even a lot of us atheists? That if you just ignore the walking on water and the whole coming back from the dead thing, you're left with a pretty decent guy. A wise teacher, a moral philosopher, a good dude. It's the safe, sensible, rational take, right? What if I told you that's the biggest mistake you can make? That it's actually impossible? What if I told you that the moment you decide to get rid of the supernatural magic, the man disappears completely along with it? And I'm not just talking about the obvious stuff. Think about it for just 1 second. Why would a bunch of fishermen instantly leave their families and their businesses to follow a complete stranger before he'd performed a single public miracle? It makes no sense. And my friend, that is just the tip of the iceberg. In the next few minutes, we're going to see how one of the most famous historical events in the Gospels is actually a scene straight out of a superhero blockbuster. And then I'm going to show you a miracle that looks less like divine intervention and more like straight up plagiarism from an older text. If you thought you could just keep the man and ditch the miracles, stick around. You're about to see why the entire story is built like a house of cards. Alright, so let's start at the very beginning of the story. Not with a big flashy miracle, but with something that's supposed to be, well, normal. Jesus calling his first disciples. The Gospels say Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee. He sees a couple of professional fishermen, Peter and Andrew, casting their nets. He walks up to them and says 2 words, "Follow me." Now here's the part we all just tend to read right past. The story says, they immediately dropped their nets and followed him. A few verses later, he does the same thing with 2 other brothers, James and John. They're in the boat with their father, mending their nets. Jesus calls them, and they instantly leave the boat and their dad to go with him. I want you to actually put yourself in that boat for a second. You were at work. This is your family business. The job that puts food on the table for you and your loved ones. A complete stranger, a guy you have never seen before, walks up and just says, "Hey, quit your job and come with me." What do? Do you instantly abandon your entire life, your income, your security, your family? I mean, come on. In the real world, people just don't do that. And here's the crucial part the story itself gives us. According to the timeline in both Mark and Matthew, this happens before Jesus has any public reputation. He hasn't healed the sick yet. He hasn't performed any famous exorcisms. To these fishermen, he's just some guy. So what has he done to merit this bizarre, life-altering decision from 4 different people? There's no explanation. The only way this story makes sense is if you accept it as a miracle in itself. It's not a supernatural spectacle, it's a social miracle, a miracle of impossible persuasion. It's the first proof that even the normal parts of the story are anything but. Alright, so maybe you're thinking, okay, Farid, the disciple thing is a bit weird, I'll give you that. But what about an event that feels more human? You know the one I'm talking about, Jesus. Filled with righteous anger, cleansing the temple. It's one of the most famous stories. On the surface, it sounds plausible, right? A passionate leader, a moment of protest, he braids a whip, flips over the tables of the money changers, drives out the merchants and the animals. It's raw, it's emotional, it feels real. But here's what the Sunday school lessons and the Hollywood movies always conveniently leave out: the sheer, unbelievable scale of what the story is actually describing. Let's start with the location. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem was a massive open-air complex. We're talking about 35 acres. Now, for most of us, that's just a number. So to put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of 25 American football fields, or 15 international football pitches, all in one place. Now, let's add the people. The story takes place during Passover, the single busiest pilgrimage festival of the year. The historian Josephus suggests over 1 million people could be in Jerusalem. That 35-acre platform would have been swarming with thousands upon thousands of pilgrims, merchants, and animals. And you can bet it wasn't unguarded. The temple had its own dedicated police force, the Temple Guard, armed and authorized to keep order. So let's just ask the rational question. Can you honestly picture one man with a homemade whip single-handedly causing enough chaos to drive everyone out of an area the size of a modern sports stadium that's packed with a crowd and patrolled by police? This isn't the biography of a spiritual leader It's the performance of a superhero from a blockbuster movie. So, if it's not a historical event, why is this story so important? The answer, once again, is that the authors weren't writing history. They were constructing a narrative to fulfill a prophecy. Specifically, they were looking at the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, verse 21, which prophesied that on the day of the Lord, there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. It's not an eyewitness report. It's a piece of deliberate literary theater, designed to put a prophetic checkmark next to Jesus' name. Another miracle that holds the story together. So we've seen a social miracle that defies real-world behavior, and a superhero miracle that defies physics. But if that's still not enough to convince you that these gospels are constructed narratives, then here's where we move from creative storytelling into what looks like undeniable copying. This isn't about fulfilling a vague prophecy. This is about using a template. First, let's go back to the Old Testament, to the book of 2 Kings. It tells a story about the prophet Elisha. In this story, Elisha is in a town called Shunem, just south of the hill of Moreh. He encounters a grieving woman whose only son has died, and he miraculously brings the boy back to life. Okay, remember that. Now let's fast forward a few hundred years to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus travels to a town called Nain, which just happens to be on the other side of the exact same hill. And as he approaches the town, he sees a funeral procession. For whom? A widow's only son. And what a coincidence. Jesus stops the procession and brings the young man back to life, returning him to his mother. I mean, come on. The same specific geographical landmark? A grieving mother who has lost her only son? The raising from the dead? This isn't a divine coincidence. It's not a prophecy being fulfilled. It's an author using a pre-existing story as a template. It is copying, plain and simple. They just changed the names and moved the location a few miles. So where does that leave us? Let's just take a step back and look at what we found. The simple foundational act of getting followers requires a social miracle of impossible persuasion. A supposedly human protest in the temple turns out to be a superhero feat that defies all logic and logistics. And one of his most profound miracles is a direct copy and paste job from an older scripture. Once you see this pattern, you realize it's woven into the entire fabric of the Gospels. It's not just these stories, it's the grand framing events of Jesus' life, events that secular historians already agree are fictional. Think about Luke's imaginary census of the entire world, forcing every family to travel to their ancestral home, a logistical nightmare that never happened. Or think about Matthew's horrific slaughter of the innocents, a terrible massacre for which we have zero historical or archaeological evidence. These aren't just errors or embellishments. They are the point. The Gospels are not history books with a few magic tricks sprinkled on top. The entire narrative is the trick. So, if you are a rational person who doesn't believe in walking on water or rising from the dead, you have to follow that logic to its honest conclusion. You can't just politely discard the supernatural events and keep the rest. The miracle isn't just in the story. The miracle is the story. And if you don't believe in miracles, then you have to face the inevitable fact. The life of the biblical Jesus, as written, never happened. It isn't history. It isn't true. So that's my take on it, looking at the evidence from a rational perspective. I know this can be a challenging topic, and I'm genuinely interested to hear what you think. Did any of these points, the social miracles, the logistics of the temple, the literary parallels, stand out to you? Let's get a good discussion going down in the comments below. And of course, if you found this breakdown valuable and it gave you something to think about, do me a favor and hit that like button. It's a huge help for the channel. Most importantly, if you enjoy challenging old ideas and want more content that looks at the world through a rational lens, make sure you subscribe to the Rational Farid so you don't miss what's next. Thanks for thinking with me today.